In a poor village deep within the African jungle, there lived a woman named Josephine. She was a beautiful and gentle woman, blessed with a happy family, a strong, tall husband who worked as a farmer, and 3 adorable, well-behaved children. But one day, a terrible plague swept through the village. No one knew where it had started. All they knew was that, one by one, families quietly perished, leaving behind cold, empty houses and bewildered, homeless children. Josephine's husband and 3 children did not survive either. Within 2 weeks, she lost everything. People say that when someone loses their dearest loved ones, they become numb. But Josephine did not. As the pain of her loss had yet to subside, she realized something even more terrifying: too many orphaned children, abandoned with no one to care for them, wandering the village like soulless shadows. One stormy night, rain poured down relentlessly, its sound tearing through the pitch-black sky. Josephine sat in her small house, listening to the downpour while trying to mend an old sweater for one of the children. Suddenly, a faint cry rose in the distance, barely audible amidst the rain. She stopped what she was doing and listened. That cry did not belong to any of the children inside. She stood up, hastily draped an old rain cloak over her shoulders, and stepped outside. Beneath the old mango tree, a little girl, about 3 years old, huddled in the cold. Her clothes were soaked, and her face was pale from hunger and chill. Her wide eyes were filled with fear, and when she saw Josephine, she shivered and cried even louder. Without hesitation, Josephine stepped forward and gathered the child into her arms. The small body trembled against her, and she could feel its frailty. Hurriedly, she carried the girl home and wrapped her in the warmest blanket she had, the one that had once belonged to her late son. That was the first child, but soon, more children began to appear. A little boy was abandoned at her doorstep. A young girl wandered alone in the forest, and then another child. With each passing day, the number of children in Josephine's home grew. She no longer had enough space for them to sleep, nor enough food to share. But she could not turn them away. She knew that if she didn't help them, they would starve, freeze, or worse, fall into the hands of those who would do them harm. Josephine began gathering dry firewood, picking fallen mangoes in the forest. She walked dozens of kilometers to the market, pleading for leftover bread from kind-hearted vendors. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not feed so many mouths. She watched as the children grew thinner, their eyes hollow with hunger, and her heart ached. But the village did not understand. Whispered rumors began to spread, passing swiftly from house to house. What is she doing? A single woman can't possibly take care of so many children, an elderly woman muttered, shaking her head in disapproval. Don't bring orphans here. The plague could return at any moment, a man snapped, casting a suspicious glance toward Josephine's house. Their words were like daggers piercing Josephine's heart. She knew the villagers were afraid that the orphaned children might bring disease back to their community. But she could not abandon them. She had already lost her family, and she could not let these children suffer the same loneliness and despair that she had endured. Yet, the village's rejection grew more apparent with each passing day. Neighbors no longer greeted her as she walked by. They avoided her home as if it were cursed. Some even threw stones at her window, shouting, "Leave this village. We don't want you or those children here." Josephine stood in the shadows, holding the frightened children close as they wept. She knew she was no longer welcome, but she had nowhere to go. No money, no place to turn to. All she had was her love for these children, and a determination never to abandon them. One night, as she sat by a small fire, trying to warm the children, a man from the village approached. He was one of those who had once spoken against her, but now, the anger in his eyes was gone. He looked at Josephine, then at the sleeping children, and sighed. "Josephine, I know you're trying to do something good, but you can't keep going like this. This village is no longer safe for you and the children." Josephine looked at him, her eyes weary but filled with unwavering resolve. "Then what should I do? I can't abandon them." The man hesitated for a moment before saying, "If you stay here, you and the children will be in danger." Josephine froze, her eyes filled with sadness and despair. One night, as the children slept soundly, Josephine heard a strange noise. She quietly got up and followed the sound. 3 masked men stood at her doorstep, whispering to one another. They were human traffickers. In impoverished areas like this, orphans were easy targets, profitable commodities. They could be sold into slavery or exploited in illegal labor factories. Josephine felt her heart pound. She knew that if these men discovered the children inside, nothing would stop them. Silently, she reached for a machete, the only weapon she had for protection, and stepped outside. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm. One of them smirked. "We heard you're taking care of a lot of orphans. We came to lighten your burden." She understood their intent immediately. "Get out of here before I make you regret it," she said, gripping the machete tightly. The traffickers burst into laughter, but one of them seemed to notice something in her eyes, a determination so fierce that they dared not underestimate her. Muttering under their breaths, they turned and left. But Josephine knew they would return. Realizing she could not go on like this, she decided to seek help. Gathering what little she had, she led the children on foot, walking dozens of miles to the nearest town. When they arrived, she stood before a grand church, fell to her knees, and pleaded, "I ask for nothing for myself. Please, just help my children. They do not deserve to die of hunger or the cruelty of this world." Fortunately, her story reached the ears of an English journalist who happened to be there. He wrote an article about Josephine and the orphan children, drawing global attention to their plight. Within weeks, aid poured in from all over the world. A humanitarian organization stepped in and helped her establish an official orphanage called the House of Hope. Josephine and the children slowly found stability at the House of Hope. But peace did not last long. One day, as she was teaching the children to read, a loud explosion echoed from the forest. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, and the frantic shouts of a crowd spread through the village. Josephine rushed outside, her heart filled with dread. A group of rebels attacked the village. They looted, burned, and kidnapped innocent people. Josephine knew that if they discovered the House of Hope, the children would be in grave danger. She quickly led them into a secret underground shelter she had prepared in advance. The space was small and cramped, but at that moment, it was their only safe haven. Meanwhile, the rebels drew closer. Josephine could hear their footsteps and loud voices. She held her breath, praying for the children's safety. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed above the shelter. One of the rebels had found the hidden door. Josephine knew she had no other choice. She gently instructed the children to stay silent and gripped the machete she always carried. As the door was torn open, she sprang forward with all her strength, knocking the rebel down and shouting, "Run! Run as fast as you can!" The children obeyed, scattering in all directions. The rebels, caught off guard, couldn't capture any of them. Josephine fought fiercely, but she knew she couldn't overpower an entire group. She was struck down and taken captive. During her imprisonment, Josephine's thoughts never left the children. She hoped they had found a safe place. She also knew the rebels wouldn't let her go easily, but she was determined not to let them destroy the House of Hope. Fortunately, news of the attack spread quickly. The English journalist who had once written about her heard what had happened and immediately contacted humanitarian organizations and the local government. A rescue team was dispatched to the village. Meanwhile, Josephine found a way to escape captivity. Taking advantage of the rebels' drunken state, she slipped away into the night, navigating her way back to the House of Hope. When she arrived, she saw the children being cared for by the rescue team. They ran to her, their eyes brimming with tears, embracing her tightly. But the story did not end there. The rebels were not willing to let go so easily. They sought revenge and planned to attack again. Josephine knew the village was no longer safe. She made the difficult decision to take the children even farther, to a place where the rebels would never find them. Their journey was perilous. They traversed dense jungles, crossed raging rivers, and trekked across barren lands. But Josephine never gave up. She encouraged the children, telling them stories of the bright future that awaited them. At last, they arrived at a small village deep in the mountains. The villagers were kind-hearted and welcomed Josephine and the children with open arms. Though their meals were simple, they were warm, and their hands were gentle, their eyes filled with compassion. It seemed as if the storms had finally passed, but fate was not yet ready to let them go. One night, as Josephine sat knitting sweaters for the children, a young boy rushed in, panting, his face pale. "Grandmother, there are strangers at the edge of the forest." Her heart clenched. Instinct warned her that danger still lurked nearby. She stood up, grabbed a wooden staff, and quietly stepped outside. In the thick darkness, she saw 3 figures standing near the forest, whispering to each other. One of them wore a tattered uniform, and in his hand, a metallic glint revealed the presence of a weapon. Josephine took a step back, but before she could retreat further, one of them spoke in a deep, hoarse voice. "We're not here to harm you. We're deserters." She narrowed her eyes, looking closer. The man was haggard, his clothes disheveled, his face lined with exhaustion. They didn't look like the ruthless rebels she had encountered before. There was no cruelty in their eyes, only fear and desperation. One of them stepped forward, his voice pleading. "We know who you are. We know how you fought to save the children. But the rebels, they won't give up. They're hunting you." A chill ran down Josephine's spine. Even after fleeing so far, even after believing she had escaped the darkness, they still refused to let her go. She tightened her grip on the staff, her voice firm. "Why should I trust you?" The youngest of the three, barely 17 or 18, trembled as he answered. "Because I am a younger brother of the soldier who helped you escape last time." Josephine froze. She remembered that fateful night when a mysterious soldier had left her a knife and whispered, "Go, before it's too late." The next day, Josephine held a secret meeting with the village elders. A decision was made. They couldn't sit and wait for another attack. This village was too small to withstand an army. They needed a plan. A little girl tugged at Josephine's sleeve, her dark eyes filled with worry. "Grandmother, are we going to run again?" Josephine knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on the child's shoulder. "No, this time we won't run. This time we will fight." Night fell quickly. The sky was as black as ink, with only a sliver of the moon casting faint light over the small village. Josephine stood among the villagers, her gaze steady but full of concern. The rebels were approaching, and the village had to be ready. She knew they couldn't afford to lose, because losing meant death for all of them, especially the children she had fought so hard to protect. The deserters, men who had once been part of the rebels but had turned their backs on brutality, were now teaching the villagers how to use bows, spears, and how to set traps. They knew that the village couldn't fight bullets head-on, but they had one great advantage. They knew the terrain like the back of their hands, and they had time to prepare. "We won't let them enter easily," said Kofi, one of the deserters, his voice filled with determination. "We'll dig traps along the main roads, set snares at the forest entrances. They won't know which path leads to life and which to death." Josephine nodded. Gripping the spear, she had forged herself from an old iron rod. She glanced toward the children being led into a hidden underground shelter where they would be safe. Her eyes burned with unwavering resolve. She would fight, not just for herself, but for every child depending on her. The fateful night arrived. Heavy footsteps echoed from the distance, accompanied by the crude laughter and taunting voices of the rebels. They marched toward the village, expecting to crush a helpless group of villagers with ease. But they were wrong. As soon as they stepped onto the main road, one of the rebels unknowingly set off a well-hidden trap. Sharp spikes shot up from the ground, piercing through his leg. His agonized scream echoed through the night, sending panic through his group. But that was only the beginning. From above, massive boulders were released, thundering down toward them. Some rebels were crushed under the weight, while others fled in terror, only to run straight into another trap. The paths leading into the forest, which seemed like an escape route, were in fact dead ends filled with more hidden snares. "Push forward. Don't let them escape," Josephine shouted, gripping her spear as she led a group of village youths out from the bushes. She was no longer just a frail woman. She was a warrior, a mother ready to sacrifice everything to protect her children. The battle erupted with ferocity. Though the villagers lacked modern weapons, they fought with all their strength and courage. Arrows whistled through the air, spears thrust into enemies with unrelenting force. The rebels, so used to preying on the weak, now found themselves overwhelmed by the fierce resistance of the villagers. Josephine charged into the fray, her spear gleaming under the moonlight. She struck down a rebel who had aimed his gun at a young villager. Her eyes burned with fury and determination. She felt no fear, only the need to fight, to protect what she loved. Kofi, the deserter, fought alongside her with everything he had. He knew that if they lost, not only would the village perish, but his conscience would die with it. He drew his bow, releasing arrows with deadly precision, each one striking down a rebel as if carrying the wrath of justice itself. The battle raged on through the night. By the time dawn broke, smoke and blood had painted the village in a haunting scene. But the villagers had won. The rebels had suffered a crushing defeat. Those who survived fled into the forest, too afraid to return. Josephine stood amidst the ruins, her breath heavy, her grip on the spear still firm. She looked at the villagers, those who had fought alongside her. Together, they had done the impossible. A small village had triumphed over a brutal army. But victory did not come without a cost. The village suffered great losses. Many had fallen, and Josephine herself was gravely wounded in battle. She was carried home, where the children waited with anxious eyes. They clung to her, crying, terrified of losing their second mother. Josephine smiled. Despite the pain, she mustered the strength to comfort them. "Don't cry. I'm still here, and we have one." But deep down, she knew her time was short. Her wounds were too severe, and this small village lacked the medicine needed to save her. She called the elders and the former soldiers to her bedside. With a weak but firm voice, she told them, "Take care of the children, protect them, and teach them to be good people. This is my final wish." The deserters, once enemies, now loyal friends, nodded solemnly. They swore to Josephine that they would protect the village and the children with their lives. That night, Josephine passed away peacefully, her hands still holding those of the children. She left with a smile, knowing she had fulfilled her duty as a mother, a protector, and a leader. The next day, the village held a simple yet heartfelt funeral for her. Hundreds came to bid their final farewell. One of the older children, no longer the naive little one of yesterday, stepped forward and spoke. "She was not my birth mother, but she was the one who taught me the true meaning of love." The children stood around her grave, promising to live well and continue the work she had started. The former soldiers became the village's new guardians. They taught the children how to fight, but more importantly, how to live in peace and love one another. The House of Hope endured, becoming a symbol of resilience and compassion. Years later, the human traffickers who once terrorized them were finally captured by the authorities. The children, now grown, returned to the village and built a school and a hospital. They named these institutions Josephine, in honor of the woman who had given her life to protect and love them. And on bright moonlit nights, when the wind whispered through the African forests, people swore they could still hear Josephine's voice reminding them, "Love and protect one another, for that is the only way we survive." Tell me what you're thinking about the stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like.